Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Rachel, and I'm a researcher at the Woodward Climate Research Centre, and I'm really excited to welcome you back to our Cryosphere Pavilion. And of course, I'd also like to welcome back those of you watching virtually from the Cryosphere hubs in Stockholm and Geneva. And of course, all of you joining on the live streams as well. And all of you, please do feel free to drop questions as you go along into the chat. Welcome to this event. This event is looking at the importance of ice shelves. And I will hand over, without any further ado, to our first speaker, Twyla from the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to everyone here, and as well as the people online. I'm Twyla Moon. I'm a glaciologist, and I'm going to provide more an overview on ice shelves, and we'll hear from Shashil and Natalia afterwards with some more on current research on ice shelves. I thought I'd put up this image to start giving you a few different pictures of what ice shelves can appear like. I'll show you some more kind of the classic image you might see in the media, large, vast, flat landscapes of ice. But in fact, ice shelves can be much more heterogeneous and dynamic, surface melt of different sorts on the surface, different texture, troughs and high points. So they can be quite a dynamic landscape, and an important one at that, in the role that they play as we think about land ice loss. So first, let's get our bearings. There are a couple of ice shelves on the Greenland ice sheet in the north. There are a few ice shelves around the northern periphery of the Greenland ice sheet, but some of the largest ice shelves in Greenland have actually broken up since the beginning of the 21st century. And most of our ice shelves are around the Antarctic continent. And I wanted to put this up here. I'm from the US, so hence the comparison to the size of the United States. But also, you can just get a sense that if we're zooming out to a scale at which we can take in the Antarctic ice sheet and the continent, we're zooming out to a scale in which we're starting to see the edges of the Earth. It's truly a massive amount of ice. It contains roughly 58 meters of potential sea level rise. It reaches several kilometers of thickness in the interior. So the potential for change in Antarctica is large, and it's really important both to our short term as well, especially to our long-term future. These are some of the kind of classic images that you might see of the edge of ice shelves. So as we look at land ice, the Antarctic continent covered by this large mass of ice, and most of that ice is sitting directly on the land beneath it, even if that land is actually below sea level. But along the edges of the continent, this land ice begins to flow off of the continent. It loses contact with the ground or topography underneath it, and it begins to float. And that's what we see as ice shelves, these large floating shelves of freshwater ice that were formerly on land, and they can be hundreds of meters thick. So because they're floating and glacial ice is somewhere around 90% the density of water, you're only seeing about 10% of the thickness of this ice shelf sticking out here from the surface. The other 90% of that surface is hidden underneath the ocean surface. They're truly massive. I wanted to include this image so that you have a little sense of scale, being able to see some people on these massive plains of ice. All right, a little introduction to the ice shelves around Antarctica. What you can see, really, the kind of gray area is outlining all of the land ice of Antarctica. That's all of the ice that's really sitting in contact with the land beneath it. And then you can see in these other kind of rainbow of red to tan to blue colors, we're seeing the ice shelves around the periphery. We usually talk about Antarctica as having the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is this large mass over here on the right, and the West Antarctic ice sheet that is curving up and pointing up towards South America. And you can see also in this image the shape of the bathymetry around Antarctica, you can get a sense that some of our largest ice shelves, the Ronne and Ross ice shelves, actually extend out of over areas with fairly high bathymetric topography. And then we have these ice shelves, particularly here in West Antarctica, that are really exposed to some much deeper bathymetry very close to them. And we'll talk about why that is important. I'm not going to cover some of the other data on this, but I will point out that along with kind of a sense of the shading giving you topography, that we also have here an ocean temperature. And so that's what will play a role as you look at the temperature of the ocean water that's able to access these different ice shelves around the exterior of the ice sheet. So ice shelves began to get our attention in the early 2000s because of the breakup of several ice shelves along the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Antarctic Peninsula. So we can think again of that peninsula kind of sticking up here. So this is our kind of Antarctic pinpoint up into more northern latitudes. And as we look at that, we actually had here at the tip of our thumb, Larsen A, Larsen B, Larsen C. So 3 different ice shelves. Larsen A broke up at a time period before we had very good satellite records of that. And then in 2002, we saw the breakup of the Larsen B ice shelf. This happened very rapidly. It's maybe a bit hard to see, but this first image up here is January 31st of 2002. We'll then move across the top row here and then through the bottom, this last image being March 17th of 2002. So this is really rapid loss of ice that took truly millennia in order to build up. But what you see happening here in late January, you can start to see some of this kind of blue texture on the surface of the ice shelf, and that's meltwater forming on the ice shelf. So what happened was we had warm foehn winds. These are warm surface winds that come over the peninsula, interact with this surface, creating surface melt. And then it looks like we had some exacerbation. It's kind of all of this water that's sitting on the top of the ice is heavier than the ice. It really wants to move downward, fracture through the ice shelf beneath it. And that's indeed what eventually happened as we started to get breakup of the edge of the ice shelf, which quickly escalated into really a complete disintegration of the Larsen B ice shelf within just these couple months in 2002. This was quite a large event. We were lucky to have instruments that could capture it. And we were also lucky to have begun to take some other important measurements of the ice sheet so that we could start to understand the implications of what losing this ice shelf meant. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind is the ice shelves are made of floating ice. So for the most part, they've already done the work of displacing water in the ocean. The breakup of Larsen B was not a big event as far as adding to sea level rise because of this breakup of the ice shelf. However, that's not the whole story, because these ice shelves play a really important role in protecting the grounded land ice that sits behind them. So just as we were watching this, we were able to take measurements of how quickly the glaciers flowing into and feeding this ice shelf were moving and how they changed in response to the loss of this ice shelf. So this is a kind of busy figure that I'll spend some time walking through here. But what you can see here is the open Larsen B ice shelf that we lost. The remnant Larsen B ice shelf down here. And then there's a few different glaciers here that each have kind of these red squares along them, and they're named. And you can see that the Flask and Leopard glaciers down here, they were still flowing into an area where we had a consistent, still existing ice shelf. That is in juxtaposition to these glaciers flowing into the area where we lost the Larsen B ice shelf. And what you can see for each of these, I'm going to step away from the microphone here and point them out. In all three of those instances, we're taking repeat measurements of the motion or velocity of these glaciers that are moving into this area. And what in all three of these instances, these other glaciers that were previously running into an ice shelf now are running into open ocean, and you can see all of them sped up. So the loss of this ice shelf essentially allowed us to open a plug in which we're now able to more rapidly move land ice to the ocean. And of course, it's this movement of land ice into the ocean that is contributing to sea level rise. So it's not the loss of the ice shelf itself and that ice, but it is how it protects the ice behind it. So of course, we wanted to ask questions within the glaciological community about what this meant as far as ice shelves around the ice sheet, and begin to understand where they are and the work they're doing. And this has sometimes been called the ice shelves as the safety band. And what you can see here is we have a scale that moves from blue to this dark orange. And as we move along that scale towards dark orange, that area of the ice shelf is doing more work to buttress the land ice behind it. And so you can kind of get a sense that many of these ice shelves, for example, this large one here, Ross in you can see that towards the interior, it tends to be much more this orange color. That's the area of the ice shelf that's doing the work to buttress the land ice behind it. And as we move to the edge, then we see more of the ice shelf that is not doing the hard work of buttressing the land ice behind it. And these kind of circles around the edge are all broken, so you can get a sense of how much work is the ice in these different ice shelves doing to kind of hold back and act as this protective safety band for the ice behind it. And to give you a sense of what this looks like here, you can see again the peninsula, that a Scar Inlet that is kind of the furthest latitude north there. That's where we have the remnant of Larsen B. And then you can see Larsen C and D just further south of that. Kind of an area where we're certainly keeping an eye out about potential continuation of this loss of Larsen A and Larsen B. And if we zoom in here to the Larsen C and D area, you can really get a sense that it's not uniform. And it is also related to where we have kind of different elements of topography. So we have two different ice rises here. Those ice rises are land that's coming up. It's in contact then with the bottom of the ice shelf. So they're acting as somewhat pinning points, we often call them, to help pin the ice shelf into place. And you can see that they're playing really important roles here out towards the edge of the ice shelf in helping to continue to buttress the land ice behind it. This buttressing is a particularly important role for the West Antarctic ice sheet, because the West Antarctic ice sheet is especially vulnerable to ice loss, largely because of the shape of the topography underneath it. So this is a look at the landscape we have underneath the ice. And what you can really get a clear sense of here is that the East Antarctic ice sheet is largely underlain by topography that is above sea level. That helps to stabilize the East Antarctic ice sheet. It's certainly helpful in kind of the maintaining ice there for the long-term future. But the West Antarctic ice sheet, you can see the vast majority of that, the topography underneath it, is well below sea level. And in fact, some of it becomes deeper as we move further inland. And this creates what we call a marine ice sheet instability. So marine ice sheet, this is an ice sheet that's sitting essentially in a marine environment, and it's particularly unstable because as we eat away or retreat the edges of that ice sheet, it can retreat into deeper water, making it more vulnerable. So the ice shelves along the West Antarctic ice sheet are playing an especially important role in helping this land ice behind it stay in place and not move as quickly to the ocean, because it's these changes in West Antarctica that we already see underway. I'll show you what that looks like here shortly, and are particularly concerning for our kind of next few centuries of sea level rise. We can already see substantial changes in the ice shelves around Antarctica. Here you can see thickness changes in these ice shelves. Again, here we're looking at a rate of thickness change over these several decades, moving from red as we're thinning the ice shelves to blue as we're thickening the ice shelves. And you can see, again, the red really stands out here in the West Antarctic ice sheet, where we're seeing substantial changes in thickness in the ice shelves, which is really increasing our concern. But there are still areas where we see thinning of ice shelves over in East Antarctica. Maybe a decade or two ago, glaciologists might not have been talking so much about East Antarctica, feeling like, oh, quite a lot of stability there. But that view has really changed as we see some of the kind of reductions in ice thickness, incursion of warm ocean water occurring in areas of the East Antarctic ice sheet, as well as the West Antarctic ice sheet. And this looking at a similar period of time. So again, we were seeing thinning of those ice shelves. And with that thinning, we're seeing an immediate response in the dynamics, in this case, the motion of movement of ice into those ice shelf areas, and how much what we call ice flux, or the kind of mass gain. So you can see that by changing the thickness of those ice shelves, we're immediately changing the motion of ice into those areas and how much ice they're moving into those areas. So this is really a very responsive system. We sometimes, the moving at the pace of glaciers. Well, it turns out glaciers and indeed ice sheets can change quite rapidly, and there's a reason that they've really entered the discussion as far as human timescales and political timescales and decision making. Some of the influences that we see in ice shelves and some of those points of vulnerability come as we see increasing evidence of surface melt occurring on ice shelves. So we think that this surface melt, for example, in that breakup of Larsen B, played a really important role as that surface water was wanting to drive open fractures or take advantages of weaknesses within the ice shelf fabric. So here you can see we get ponds, we get streams, kind of all of these areas where we often think of Antarctica as a place without much surface melt, but indeed there's evidence of surface melt occurring in the Antarctic summer all around the periphery of the continent. But particularly important for ice shelves is the role of the ocean. This graphic kind of points out not just the role of the ocean, but also these many different ways in which we're monitoring and learning about ice shelves. So you can get a sense that we now have tools that are telling us about how quickly the ice is moving, about changes in the surface elevation and the thickness, telling us things about the character of the ocean water close by, and about the amount of mass that we have in the ice sheet. But what I want to emphasize here is this kind of difference as we see here with particularly this kind of red line that we see coming up from the ocean. The warmest waters in the ocean are not at the surface. They're at depth. And it's particularly important that we are understanding the bathymetry and the shape of the ocean landscape around the Antarctic ice sheet so that we can understand where is it that this warm, deep ocean water can crawl up onto the continental shelf and really access the space underneath these floating ice shelves. And in fact, there are ways in which we really prime moving that water into particular areas underneath the ice shelf. So what happens is as we're moving ice from the continent out into the ice shelf. So here you get kind of this big bumpy texture as the ice is sitting on the landscape, but you can see as that ice kind of crosses this black line, it's moving into the ice shelf, and you can see we develop these long sort of flow lines. It's a very different surface texture than we have on this land ice. Part of what's happening is over here on the left side. You can think of that as the ice that is kind of just sitting at the edge. It's still grounded on land. It's moving towards the ice stream. And then on the right, we have the ice that is streaming in the ice stream, right? But this ice in the ice stream is moving at a different speed than the ice that is sitting on land. And that produces what we call a shear margin, as one thing is moving more quickly past the other thing. And what that does is it causes a lot of damage and change in the ice sheet character in that margin, which encourages development of troughs and changes. So it encourages development of lows in the surface, and those often transform and evolve into troughs in the base of the ice shelf. And these different texture and kind of like upward troughs in the base of the ice shelf really provide routes for warm ocean water to move and traverse underneath these ice shelves and intensify areas of melt, which help to make these ice shelves more vulnerable to breakup. So you can get the sense that what we see happening here is a kind of a move as we have this floating ice. So this kind of center area is part of the floating ice shelf, and then this broken up side are at these shear margins, and you can see really clearly that it's these shear margins where we kind of start to break up the ice shelf, and these large rifts then tend to migrate further into the ice shelf, eventually breaking through and breaking off parts of the ice shelf. So these shear margin, these parts where we have differential motion and ice is not moving as quickly on land as it's moving in the ice shelf, are really important for how we create the character of the ice shelf itself, and how we really allow access points for rupture and breakup of the ice shelf, as well as motion of ocean water underneath it. And so I thought I wanted to just show kind of one image in which we're actually looking at an ice shelf in Greenland. So briefly move your brain back up to the northern hemisphere. These are one of the few ice shelves remaining here on Petermann Glacier in the far north of Greenland. And what you can see here is bottom melt. This is from ocean. And that black line is indicating again where the ice is going from being in contact with the bed and topography underneath it to going afloat. And you can see that there are these long channels that form in the ice sheet, and that it's within those channels that we really intensify melt from these warmer ocean waters. And these warmer ocean waters are evident in many places, both warming ocean waters in Greenland as we warm ocean waters at 200, 400 meters depth. But these ocean waters are also really evident in these important areas of West Antarctica that are particularly vulnerable. This is showing you data, oceanography data from, this is Pine Island Glacier. This is part of West Antarctica. It's an area of a particularly rapid change right now. And what you can really clearly see is how this warm, deep water that's kind of mostly below 200 meters depth is really able to move in here and access the space underneath this ice shelf, access the space where this ice shelf makes contact with the ground underneath it. And this is particularly worrisome as it's able to kind of eat away at what we call the grounding zone, this zone of contact, help to push this back, retreat, and also to melt that ice shelf above it and cause that to thin and become more vulnerable as well. And all of this together, these changes that are happening around ice shelves, are really translating to mass changes for the Antarctic ice sheet itself. So I'm just going to wrap up with a short visual here of the changes that we see in the Antarctic ice sheet. This is data. I'll start this movie in just a second. This is data taken from a pair of satellites called GRACE and GRACE Follow-On. Each of these satellites is actually two satellites that work together to measure how the change in ice mass is changing Earth's gravity. So they measure changes in Earth's gravity, and we're able to take that and interpret that into changes in ice mass. It's truly a phenomenal technology that has changed the way not only that we understand ice mass, but also changes in groundwater, changes in where water is in the ocean. They're a very powerful pair of instruments. And when up in 2002, you can see there's kind of a funny point here where we had a break between the GRACE and the GRACE Follow-On satellites. And then as I start this movie, you'll see some of these flow lines that are indicating to you where the ice in the Antarctic ice sheet is moving. That's an important element of being a glacier or being an ice sheet, is that ice is moving. And so you'll be able to see that ice moving, and you'll also be able to see kind of as we're accumulating mass loss or mass gain around the Antarctic ice sheet over these last couple of decades. You'll see right away that the West Antarctic area starts to stick out, Pine Island and Thwaites. Really intense areas of ice loss where it's likely that already underway is a process of slow and irreversible loss in this region. But despite that being irreversible, the rate at which that change happens is still highly dependent on our global temperature and emissions decisions. So the decisions being made here during this week, during next week, will be directly influencing how quickly we see this process play out in Antarctica and how quickly we see sea level rise arriving at our shores around the globe. All right. I just wanted to give that brief kind of introduction to ice shelves and then pass the floor off to hear a bit more.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Twyla. That was absolutely brilliant. And yeah, just a reminder for those of you listening online, if you've got questions for Twyla, do pop those in the chat and we can come back to them later. And for now, I would like to invite Sushil to give our next talk. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was awesome. This is a great follow-on from Twyla's talk. My name is Sushil, and I work at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And today I'm going to talk about how the role of Antarctic ice shelves in the global climate system and how changes in the ice shelves in Antarctica affect us all. So a little bit more about us. We work at Scripps in San Diego. It's in Southern California. Beautiful place if you want to come visit. So this is the newly formed Polar Center, of which Natalia and I, who are going to present in this talk, are part of. Helen is who I did my PhD with. Just graduated this year. And it's a growing set of researchers in earth sciences, polar oceanography. That's Fiamma Stranio. Biology, Jeff Bowman, Jeff Seringast does ice cores, and Maria Vernay's biology again. And yeah, we've got an amazing polar research group going, covering almost all relevant topics in ice sheets and glaciers. Yeah, so Twilight gave an introduction to the ice sheet system, but I think it's always useful to distinguish between the floating ice shelves around Antarctica, the grounded ice sheet, and sea ice. So sea ice is basically frozen ocean. It just forms almost seasonally, sits on top of the ocean. Sea ice is typically maybe 1 to 10 meters thick, but ice shelves, which are these floating extensions of the grounded ice sheet, can be hundreds of meters thick. So if you lose ice shelves or sea ice, you don't raise sea level because they're already floating. But if you lose ice shelves, there's major implications for what happens to grounded ice behind it. While I show this, I'm not going to go too deeply into it. So this shows mass loss in Antarctica, and most of my talk is going to focus on West Antarctica, which is the part of the ice sheet that's changing the most. I really like this way of visualizing ongoing changes over the ice sheet. So each one of these boxes is sitting on top of the Manhattan skyline, and that demonstrates how big a gigaton of ice looks like compared to the skyline. So currently, and this is based on data from AR6, which is being presented there in the Science Pavilion. So currently, Antarctica is losing one of these blocks every 3 days. Greenland's losing one of these blocks every 2 days, is much more frequent. And glaciers, the global glaciers in Antarctica, Greenland, on the peripheries of Antarctica and Greenland, and across the world, they're losing one of these every single day. So and it's almost an unimaginable amount of ice loss that we don't get to see because we're very displaced from it. But this is actively contributing to ongoing sea level rise. So yeah, the figure on the left from the IPCC report, AR6 came out this year, shows the different contributors to sea level rise. Broken up this way, thermal expansion is still one of the larger contributors, so that's just the ocean expanding as the temperature rises. Glaciers are the next biggest component, followed by Greenland and Antarctica. And the reason I'm focusing on Antarctica today is those uncertainty bars. So we are very uncertain about changes in Antarctica compared to other parts of the climate system. And that's even more relevant when you go into the future. So that's a low emissions SSP 2.6 scenario going into 2100, and that's a high emission scenario. And it shows the uncertainties in all the different projections. So the uncertainty in thermal expansion sort of increases linearly. It increases with the uncertainty in temperature change with those emissions. And the contribution to sea level rise also increases as you go into a high emission scenario. But if you look at Antarctica, in both a medium and a higher emission scenario, the contribution to sea level rise is actually kind of similar, but the uncertainties are massive. They're an order of magnitude bigger than any other contributor to sea level rise. And this is why we really need to study Antarctica more, because if we have these uncertainties, it's really hard to plan our resilience towards sea level rise. Yeah. So this is an example of a place a few hundred miles north of us. This is in Santa Barbara. So this is what the plot on the left shows what flooding would look like with just 25 centimeters of sea level rise. And the plot on the right shows what flooding would look like with also 25 centimeters, but if a big annual storm hits. And an annual storm will hit once a year. So that's kind of the level of flooding you could see with just 25 centimeters. And you can see pretty much the entire airport, which is fairly low-lying in Santa Barbara, is all underwater. With current predictions, because we're so uncertain about sea level rise in the future, we think this is going to happen in an SSP1 scenario, which is fairly low. We think this is going to happen anytime between 2050 and 2080. And imagine being a city planner and you're given this information with these massive uncertainties. It's a 30-year range, and that's only with one scenario. And a lot of that uncertainty is from Antarctica. If you removed the Antarctic contribution, you could predict sea level rise much, much better, maybe within 10 years. And the reason for the high uncertainty in sea level rise from Antarctica is kind of twofold. So first, we've got uncertainties in the global climate models that all the ice sheet models use. So this figure shows multiple simulations of multiple ice sheet models. So each color is an individual climate model, and a single color, so there's a bunch of light purples along with the purple, is individual ice sheet models. So there's a lot of uncertainty between the climate models, but even if you pick a single climate model, there's a lot of uncertainty between the different ice sheet models. So there's these two sources of uncertainty that are feeding off each other and leading to what we're getting in the IPCC, which is almost untenably large uncertainties. So we hope in our work that if we measure changes of the Antarctic ice sheet better, we'll be able to constrain models better, and with that we can help improve projections. And we're already starting to do that. And the way we observe it is fairly simple. So imagine an ice shelf floating off into the ocean. It can lose mass through three fairly distinct processes. So first, it can lose mass from below. So warm oceans can melt the ice from below. Second, as the ice stretches, as it flows on the ocean, you can start breaking off icebergs. These icebergs can be massive. You can land a plane on some of them. And third, you can gain mass if there's more snowfall going onto the ice sheet. I want to quickly go back one slide and show that some model projections actually show increases in mass over Antarctica because some models actually think there's going to be more snow over the ice sheet. So the big range of projections could include sea level drop because there's more snow on the continent, but that's only a small fraction of all projections. So with satellites, you can measure each of these three processes. So again, fairly simple idea. It's a little harder to implement from an engineering perspective, but if you've got increased snowfall, the height of the surface of the ice goes up. If you've got an iceberg that's separated from the ice shelf, you've seen ice and then you see ocean, so you're able to distinguish them fairly easily. And if you remove mass from below, you also see a decrease in height as the ice starts thinning. So fairly simple principle. And the way we observe it is using satellite altimeters. And this is a great video by NASA that shows how altimeters measure heights at different surfaces around the continent. So these instruments measure vegetation, sand dunes, mountains, and so this is just an illustration of the satellite, and it's got 6 laser beams. It's the latest and greatest, cost $1 billion. It's a little too much for NASA, but it works brilliantly, and it's been running for 3 years now without any issues. And it's been giving us some great information on what's happening to the Antarctic ice sheet. This is a figure from a paper we published recently on looking at height changes over the Antarctic ice sheet between ISAT and ISAT-2. ISAT was the precursor to the new mission. So what you see here on the left is in the region labeled Amundsen Sea, you've got thinning on the floating ice shelves, and where there's thinning on the floating ice shelves, there's thinning on the grounded ice sheet right behind it. So this really, again, highlights this process called buttressing that Twyla showed, where if you start thinning an ice shelf, it reduces the friction on the areas surrounding it. So there's friction on the mountains, friction at the bed, and as you start thinning an ice shelf, the amount of friction reduces, and you can start draining more grounded ice, which actively contributes to sea level rise into the ocean. So the concept of buttressing came from architectural buttresses. So imagine an equivalent scenario where you have a building that's supported by a buttress. You could either thin it, as you're seeing over there, by more melting from the ocean, or you could remove it completely, as Twyla showed with the disintegration of Larsen B, and both those scenarios would cause the underlying structure to collapse. So that's where the idea of buttressing comes from. One of the most important questions, and we've really not had an answer to this until very recently, is why are Antarctic ice shelves shrinking? Of all places to look, it turns out the place to look was El Niños and La Niñas. So El Niños and La Niñas happen in the tropical Pacific, 1,000 miles away from Antarctica. But what happens in the tropical Pacific around Hawaii and those regions affects Antarctica in a big, big way. And this is one of the reasons we're having major ice loss now. So how this works is changes in the tropical Pacific, which is up here, can go all the way down to West Antarctica, which is all the way down there. And it's an unbroken, you can have signals that transmit because in a consistent way because there's no land between those two areas. So Antarctica and the tropical Pacific, one of the most variable regions on Earth. And one of the reasons we weren't able to identify changes in Antarctica was because there's so much variability that you really need a long record to identify that variability. So the figure up top here shows the winds in front of the Antarctic ice shelves, and they're slowly going further and further eastward, and it'll continue to go eastward as global temperatures increase. And what eastward winds do is change the circulation in front of Pine Island Glacier, PIG, and drive more warm water under those ice shelves. So the figure on the left shows a standard year where there is no El Nino, there's no La Nina, and there's some warm water going under the ice shelves, but not that much. So the figure on the right shows the La Nina year, and this has been observed by putting instruments in the ocean that go under the ice shelves. An amazing engineering, it's amazing craft and engineering. And what they find is during the La Nina year, there's less warm water under the ice shelves. So conversely, during an El Nino year, there's more warm water, and we've been having more El Nino-like conditions in Antarctica that are actively thinning ice right now. Here's one way in which we, in our group at Scripps, measure changes under the ice surface. It's really difficult to take ships out there because there's sea ice and you can't traverse those regions really easily. So we drop instruments from airplanes. So this is a plane flown by the New York Air National Guard. The parachute in that instrument package contains a float that goes up and down within the water column. You can even go under hundreds of meters of ice and then come back out and tell us what's happening below the ocean surface. So we've dropped a bunch of these out into the ocean recently, and this figure shows the location near Ross Ice Shelf. Each of these blue symbols with the 198, those numbers are each location of float. So we've flown across the front of the ice shelf, dropping these floats, and they've been giving us really invaluable information on how the ocean's changing in those locations. So one of the problems with field observations, so they're amazing data, and they really tell us a lot about what's going on, but they can't tell us everything about changes around the continent. And for that, we need to go back to satellite data, which can go everywhere. So here's a result from our group, a recent result from our group. This is looking across the continent using satellite data to look at changes in the thickness of the ice shelves around Antarctica. And here you can see over the last 20 years, you have about 4,000 gigatons. Imagine each of these blocks sitting on top of Manhattan. Now imagine 4,000 of them. And that's the loss we've been observing since the beginning of our satellite record, which is fairly recent in climate terms. So changes in the ice shelves don't just stay in Antarctica. They can have global environmental consequences. So we've had a talk from Rob DeConte that showed how changes in ice could cause sea level rise and how sea level rise can go across the globe. So here is a figure that shows that the melt of land ice is already starting to dominate the global sea level budget. So ocean thermal expansion, again, just the expansion of water due to increasing temperatures, is always going to cause sea level rise, but not at the rates at which land ice can contribute to it. And the contribution of sea level rise from land ice loss isn't the same across the world. So if you dump a ton of ice from Antarctica, it turns out that, or West Antarctica, it turns out that California and regions in the Western US, regions in the US are actually affected disproportionately due to the rotation of the Earth and a bunch of complicated things where the water is distributed not equally around the globe. So the Antarctic ice sheet is so large that it has its own gravitational pull on the water around it. So if you lose ice, you can move that water away. So for every foot of global sea level rise from West Antarctica, you actually have 1.3, so 30% more sea level rise along the California coast. And each of the ice sheets has a different fingerprint. So Greenland would impact South America more, weirdly. and Antarctica impacts North America more. Ice shelf dynamics, changes in ice shelves also affect the global oceans. So Antarctica is surrounded by oceans, and all those oceans connect back into all the ocean systems around the world. So this is a figure from the special report on oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate, the SROC that came out a couple of years ago, and it really shows Antarctica's place in the Southern Ocean and the global oceans. So ice loss from Antarctica not only affects sea level rise, it affects freshening of the ocean's surface that causes changes in precipitation. It can also affect coastal ecosystems, which Natalia works on. And she's going to talk about how ice affects biology around us. So thank you. And over to Natalia.
Hi, everybody. Hope everybody can hear me fine. So I'm going to switch a little bit and kind of show you what might be some of the impacts of sea ice changes into the biology. And I'm going to take you to, so we can examine the microscopic life of the microbial community in the sea ice. First, I just want to start by introducing the lab that I'm part of in Scripps Institute of Oceanography, the Bowman Lab. And our lab, we're really interested in sort of using genetic tools to better understand the microbial community and the role that they're playing in biogeochemical cycles and how they might be responding to different anthropogenic stressors and climate change. And so here, I just want to kind of highlight the importance of the microbial community and how important changes in sea ice might have some impacts in how microbes might be responding. So one thing that I kind of want to highlight is first kind of the role of phytoplankton in absorbing carbon dioxide and doing photosynthesis, and how that sort of carbon gets aggregated into particular organic matter, and that gets deposited into the deep sea. But there are other interactions between that phytoplankton community with the microbial community. And the other thing I want to highlight here is sort of how that carbon might be transferred to other higher trophic levels in the food web. And as we heard in all the amazing talks over the past days here, is the polar regions are changing rapidly, and they're extremely sensitive to human activity. And what you see here in this graph is the annual Arctic sea ice minimum area over from 1975 to 2020. And one of the things that I just want to highlight here is that we see a loss in sea ice during all the different seasons, and we see that kind of overall trend over time. And there are many implications in terms of sea ice. As we see a decrease in sea ice concentrations, we starting to see younger and thinner sea ice. And this study by Lanunzo and that was recently published sort of examined what might be some of the implications associated to ecosystem. And even though there's still a lot of sort of uncertainties in understanding what might be some of the responses, I want to highlight two that are likely to decrease. And one of those is the biological carbon pump. So this is when phytoplankton is uptaking carbon, and that gets sequestered into the deep ocean, and also of biodiversity. So we expect to see a loss of biodiversity with changes in sea ice. And climate change is going to have impacts in the sea ice ecosystem service that they can provide. And here in this figure, you can see how this ecosystems provide many services, such as mentioning sequestration of carbon, but also providing habitat for many different fauna, as well as cultural service that they provide to many communities. So we can think in terms of sort of fisheries, tourists, but also cultural resources to the communities that are closely linked to the sea ice ecosystem. And the way we go, sorry, I don't know why I came out really moved, but the way we go about studying that is using an omic approach, so using genetics, but also transcriptomics to understand what microbes are there and what are they doing and how they might be responding to some of these anthropogenic stressors. And we take different kind of approaches by doing some expeditions and measurements at field, but also lab incubations, and then try to build models to understand changes in the microbial community. And some of our work is in the Western Antarctica Peninsula, and this is part of the Palmer long-term monitoring. And one of the things that I want to highlight is that this time series are extremely important, and I'm sorry that it's all a little bit moved, are extremely important when we want to understand change, and that there are very few long-term time series that can enable us to understand what might be some of that response. And here, what I'm want to highlight is sort of that interaction between phytoplankton and bacteria. So as phytoplankton become more productive, the release of DOC can be incorporated, of dissolved organic carbon can be incorporated into bacteria, and we can measure that by looking at the bacteria production. And here I'm just kind of showing one example of using machine learning approaches with self-organizing map. And what this allows us to do is kind of reduce the dimensionality of the different microbial community. We tend to have a very kind of complex ecosystem, but we can reduce that to get at what might be some of those particular taxonomic modes that might be playing an important role in driving changes associated with sea ice losses. And one of the things that we can then do is sort of combine it with bacterial production, and that's what you see at the bottom is a graph showing changes in bacterial production. So this is done by measuring incorporation of leucine, which is an amino acid, and we can then incorporate both and start to see what might be some of those changes between taxonomy and bacterial production and how they might be changing over time. And another thing that I want to highlight is this response to phytoplankton and how linked their metabolism is linked to sea ice conditions. And here in this study, we examine, we use transcriptomic and lipidomics to measure different metabolites that might be active during sea ice retreat. And one of the things you can see here, and I just want to highlight, so we look at different phytoplankton groups, but we look at what might be some of the different genes that might be expressed. And that's what is showing here is what might be the taxonomy groups that show a major sort of difference in those transcriptome changes. And here we were able to identify what specific pathways were associated to that. But what I want to highlight is that there is a quite diverse sort of metabolic response that can really help us to understand what might be some of those different niches that we are seeing in the sea ice environment. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that the lab has been doing as being part of the Mosaic International Arctic Trip Expedition. And this is an interdisciplinary effort that was launched to study the Arctic as it's rapidly changing. And so this was a ship, the Polarstern, that threaded for ice for 398 days, where 300 scientists from all kind of different expertise came together to understand what are some of the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. And here I just want to give you a little bit of some snapshot of some of the work that it's been done, where when we look at the sea ice interface, we're able to identify different biological signals. And so what you see here at the bottom in the sea ice picture is that there is a more kind of fresher layer. We have like a more mixed and a more salty, and all those layers are associated with a particular signal in oxygen. And what the graph right it's showing here is the sort of the salinity on the x-axis, but the oxygen concentration. And what we see is that the more fresher has a lower level of oxygen. And so what that means is that we are seeing now an increase in the heterotrophic activity, and we're also able to kind of capture some of the difference that might be associated with difference in community structure. And with all these changes, we know that there are communities that are extremely that depend on the sea ice for their survival. And one of the things that I kind of want to highlight is this project that I've been working on, where we're sort of thinking about what might be some of the linkage between the sea ice and land. And I'll just show you a little bit of one example in Alaska, in the Aleutian Island. And the motivation for this comes really based on what communities have learned, how they have experienced their environment. And Inuit people in the Arctic regions in Canada and Greenland and Alaska, they have recognized that these ecosystems are very interconnected. And this has been, they have done many sort of observations in how they perceive those changes. But what I want to highlight is sort of the Western, more modern scientific understanding this land and sea linkage. It's pretty in its infancy in comparison to how these communities have understand the interconnected of their ecosystem. And here's just an example of some of the work that how we are thinking about what might be some of those changes. If there are changes in the more terrestrial system, we are going to see some impacts in the marine ecosystems. And here's in the context of invasive species. And when we have islands that are healthy, we see a higher presence of seabirds, and they are extremely important in transferring nutrients. But when we have presence of invasive species, that gets completely altered, and we see losses in seabird and biodiversity and changes in nutrient cycling, and that gets observed both in the terrestrial and the marine system. And we're still trying to understand what might be some of how those linkers might be responding in terms of climate change and invasive species. And with that, I just kind of want to conclude on this paper that was put on by Sterling in 2017, where they kind of examined that. So there are all these different types of knowledge, and what you see on top A is different ways of how this type of knowledge can interact. So we have knowledge coming from the climate and biodiversity and politics and market systems, but we also have in situ kind of knowledge that comes from the local communities. And sometimes they can operate. So there are different scenarios. So the first one on top A is like where these knowledge systems are not interacting among each other. We see quite a disconnect. We could have cases as in panel B, where there is not a quite of a connection, but you see that sort of the climate market system and others might be imposing some kind of knowledge and this more in situ knowledge. But what we really want to get at is a way to sort of integrate those different kind of knowledge system, because that can lead to more effective conservation policies. And with that, I just want to have this final conclusion. Microbes are a key component in the polar ecosystem, in the food web dynamics and nutrient cycling. And the microbial dynamics can really help us understand the buffer capacity of these ecosystems in response to climate change. And understanding this linkage is quite important when we think about how these ecosystems might respond to climate change. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the Jeff Bowman Lab, the Palmer LTR monitoring, the Mosaic team, and all of you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. That was a really fascinating set of presentations. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So I'd like to invite the three of you, or if you're still around and available, to pop back up here. And it would be fantastic to hear any questions from those of you watching virtually, or at the Stockholm or the Geneva hubs. Do we have any questions from there yet? No, not yet. Okay. Well, in that case, it would be great to open it up to all of you here. Would you like to come up to the microphone so we can hear your question?
Hi. Can you hear me? Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I just wanted to ask about what we read about the trapped bacteria, going back to the ancient sheets. Any information, and would that leave any impact to the ecosystem or to the whether in the area or wider, if you can?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And we don't really know much about how active, what it means for those trapped bacteria in terms of sort of becoming more active, and what might be some of the responses in metabolism. We don't really know much, and one of the challenge we don't know much in terms of the genetic compositions. We don't have genomes for some of these taxes, so it might be really hard to sort of understand what might be some of these changes. But I think this also offers an opportunity because there's been quite a rapid expansion with new genetic techniques, and I think that's sort of going to be moving forward so we can better understand how those trapped bacteria what might be some of the implications with ecosystem function.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, I might take the opportunity to ask one then to you again, Natalia. I was really fascinated by the project you talked about at the end of your presentation linked to traditional ecological knowledge. And I was wondering if you mentioned that sort of Western scientific understanding, in contrast, is really in its infancy. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that and talk about sort of as scientists the lessons perhaps that we should be conscious of or we should learn in terms of kind of co-producing knowledge and collaborating more effectively.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and this is something that I've been thinking a while. And so one of the things that, or the main kind of driver for that, for this new study is really that the traditional ecological knowledge has sort of been, we haven't really incorporated that in sort of the way we're thinking how ecosystems are changing. And so when I was kind of mentioning is that the Western science it's in infancy when we're trying to think about how linkage those ecosystems. But if you talk to the communities, they have experienced how interconnected those ecosystems are. And I think something that is really important is that we as scientists start listening. So what the communities and how they have experienced changes, but also how do we enable proper collaborations that can actually lead us to co-production of knowledge. And I think, that it's a really, it takes a lot of time and building trust. And but I think that is really important as we, think forward how how we can build climate resilience and how communities might be responding to all these different impactors with climate change.
Thank you. And I think that's a great point to be conscious of, especially here at COP as well. Does anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? Any more questions from? Nope. Okay. In that case, I think we'll wrap up. Our next event is at either 4 o'clock, so just in 15 minutes, and that will be focusing on West Antarctica. So you're very welcome to stick around, and thank you so much for joining us.